Okay, we're going to introduce our speaker tonight, Phil Brueck. Or do you want to have an opening song first?
Opening song. Opening song.
That was a
Gotta have a
condition,
song.
Tom.
Yeah, Phil made it a condition that I would sing something. So, you lucky people, I just feel you're so blessed. I'm going to sing my Bobby Dylan ripoff song, which is called For the Climate We're A-Changing. And I wrote this during the Spring General Conference in 2016. And here we go. Come all who can see the dire signs of change. The temperature's rising beyond our range. The glaciers are melting before our eyes. Our carbon is heating the skies. Is our convenience worth such compromise? For the climate we are a-changing. Come all who believe that the balance is lost. This electrical life is not worth the cost. That buses, bicycles, taxis, and trains are part of the plan to fight evil. It's our addiction to oil and coal. For the climate we are a-changing. The time it is now to act and to call. The carbon excesses must be known to all. Ignore the deniers, there always are those. Ask Noah who built the great ark. And when it was raining, they beat at his walls. For the climate we are a-changing. For the climate we are a-changing. That's all, folks.
We've had the pleasure of hearing from Phil before. I'm going to be brief. Phil has just been a terrific friend and someone I've learned a lot from. For about 15 years, he's been a close friend after he married a good friend of mine and my first cousin Sandy. He's very well qualified to address the topic we're going to hear about, which is public lands, as he was raised to a large degree in Zion Park and then spent 30 years working for the National Park Service and enjoying the best lands, the best public lands that this country has to offer. He has a lot of great experiences to share with us, a lot of wisdom, and I probably said enough, so I'll just turn it over to Phil to hear about public lands. Thank you for joining us again, Phil.
So can everybody see that picture of Zion? Are we on now?
Can't see it yet. There we go.
Okay. Well, I feel honored, but kind of somewhat overwhelmed to talk about a subject that's so darn political. But really, it's quite simple. The main questions are: how did we get where we are today? What's the value to our nation and the state of Utah of these public lands? And what would be the impact if the public lands were transferred to the state and private ownership? As Dave said, I moved around a lot. I spent most of my career in the South and the East. and I can testify from personal experience the superior value of having public lands. I lived in a lot of states that had few public lands, and I guess that's why all of the people from back east and that come to the west to see it. But consider, if you will, what Grand Canyon or Zion would look like if it was private. Think where the multi-million-dollar homes and the no trespassing signs would be, and the lack of access to the canyon rim or up Zion. Think of Arches, where those big homes would be, and how that would screw up the landscape in our own personal experience. So to the subject at hand, I'm bothered a lot by the rhetoric that I increasingly hear about how at the time of statehood, Utah was promised we'd get our land back. The Constitution doesn't provide for public ownership by the federal government, and the last one, how these lands are always locked up. And so what I'd like to do is just take a little look at how we got these lands and how the processes that took place to get them where we are. I'm waiting for my screen to advance here. There we go. We can start with the Articles of Confederation. And what happened here was a time in our history when our forefathers were trying to decide how our country would be managed, if we were successful in getting rid of the British rule. As they began to solidify what they do, they started what was called the Articles of Confederation, and 6 of the original 13 states claimed land all the way to the Mississippi River. And the other 7 said, forget that, that's not right, that the land belongs to all of us. And so they negotiated this language in here, that the lands would be considered, first of all, that no states existed until everybody agreed that a state did exist and had this boundary, and that all the lands would be considered common property of the nation because of how we got them. And we don't have time to go into the history of how our country acquired the lands, but it's really a fascinating progression of wars and treaties and purchases. But I'd note that in 1847, when the pioneers entered the Salt Lake Valley, it wasn't U.S. federal land. It was Mexico. It was a foreign land. And then we have the issue whether or not the federal government can own land. Let's look at what's called the property law, the property clause in the Constitution. It says that Congress shall have power to dispose of and to make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the U.S., and nothing be construed to go against those claims. So in other words, the federal government can own property and territory in common. We, as the citizens, get to own that. So how did we get to, or how do we make it so that private individuals could own their own lands from when we had this negotiating time at the 13 colonies? And first of all, after the Revolutionary War, our government had no money. And so they were paying the soldiers in land, and they began to also sell various segments of land. And so here's what was going on, that they would give 100 acres for a soldier to 100 acres for is part of that broken up? Can you see all that screen?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I lost it just now. Get back here now. Somehow I lost it on my screen. I can't see it on mine all of a sudden. I'm not sure what I did, but
We're looking at the Lands Act, the bounty lands, and 180 million acres sold. And I'm wondering, how big is 180 million acres?
that's pretty large.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I can't remember. I looked up to see what the state of Utah had. I think the state of Utah is a little over 54 million acres. So it gives you an idea of what that was.
Gotcha.
I may have to just wing it from my end, but I have a pretty good way of seeing that. So we'll just see how it goes. anyway, so what we have in this is then the soldiers got paid, and then they began to sell off the land, as you see in this slide. Then we had the Homestead Act come along. There we go. So the Homestead Act then provided, as people migrated into this area, that they could get 160 acres, and it would be given to the head of household. And then it increased to 320 and 640 as the good lands got taken, and the lesser light lands, they were trying to encourage people to go into that. You had to be 21, you had to live on the land for 5 years, and you could build a house on it. And a head of household could be a man or a woman. So then we have the Railroad Act. We're still looking for a way to raise funds. So the nation wanted to have railroads built, which helped with the settlement of land and also transportation need. And as the tracks were laid across the land, the railroad companies were given 200 foot on each side of the track as a right-of-way. And then for every mile completed, the companies were given as much as 13,000 acres. And in total, through this act, it was 180 million acres given to the railroad companies. So then we have, in 1785, Thomas Jefferson established what is known as the rectangular survey system for gridding the entire country. And each section of land is 6 miles square, and 36 square miles in that is a township. And so in that, as part of this, then, this is the way the state of Utah looks for that survey, that rectangular thing. So if we look in the state of Utah, it looks like this in part of it. You see, this is Lake Powell here, but this is how it looks. And what happens if you look and see those small squares in there, those are state trust lands. We talk about that a lot. Our nation's early leaders believed that a strong democracy was founded upon a well-educated public and established the trust lands that were given to each new state to support certain functions, which I'll show you in a minute. So in every township, Utah was given 4 sections. Sections 2, Section 16, Section 32, and 36. What's interesting is that Colorado and Wyoming on both sides of us were only given 2 sections for each township, and I'm not sure that's why. Maybe Brigham got in there and got some inspiration, but that's how that system was set up. So Utah received those 4 sections per township, and what they received then as part of that grant was 7.5 million acres in 1896. And they have sold more than 4 million acres of that land. So right now they hold about 3.5 million acres that are left over that. And they were given to the states to use or to sell and gain the monies for these purposes. And that's why we call them state trust lands. The biggest thing was the public schools. And of the about the 7.4 that was sold, that's the return from that. So then we have the Utah Statehood Act, which made it a state in 1896. When the pioneers first got into Utah, it was Mexico, and then one of the treaties, the land became U.S. territorial land, and then the state of Utah was formed from those lands in 1896. And for those who claim that Utah was promised the federal land back, this is what the Statehood Act says, that the people inhabiting said proposed state, Utah, do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof. It's really interesting. And then it goes on to say that the state of Utah shall not be entitled to any further or other grant of land for any purpose than expressly provided in this act. Those are pretty clear. And again, as a general public, we're all ignorant of that. And I would note that Congress has the ability to do anything, and they can certainly change that, but that's the law that's on the book right now when we talk about getting our federal lands back. When we look at other things that were occurring at the time in the early 1900s, logging was done like this. It was clear cutting. And then the land would be logged, the logging companies would leave. There was still enough topsoil in there that grasses began to grow. And then that meant that they could put livestock and especially sheep in those areas, and they completely took out a lot of the grasslands. And so we had came about in 1891 was called the Forest Reserve Act, and it allowed the president to set aside forest reserve. The public really got concerned because even here in Utah, I mean, there was a big mudslide into Manti because of the forest had gone, and there was nothing holding the land together. And there's pictures in the history of the city of Manti being in a lot of trouble. You have a lot of sheep along the Wasatch Front, and some of the water began to taste a little weird when you have hundreds of thousands of sheep in your watershed. So the people began to ask, let's have some protection for our forests. And so President Harrison signed 13 million acres in. Then Grover Cleveland signed another 25 million. McKinley signed another 7 million. And then Teddy Roosevelt, which is kind of one of the fathers of environment, signed 150 million into under this Federal Reserve thing. So we have in the U.S. Forest Service then is created officially in 1905 with approximately 193 million acres under this Forest Reserves Act. Well, then because people were beginning to go the other way now, they're getting upset because, gee, we've got too many forest preserves now. And so we have this act called the Agriculture Appropriations Act, is proposed in 1907, and the amendment prohibited any further forest reserve designations in these states. You'll notice that Utah is absent from it. And Utah supported the act because they had seen the results of the deforestation and the loss of land and all the resources. So they support it. So the law required Roosevelt to sign it by March 7th, 1907. And he and Pinchot, who was the new head of the Forest Service, before Roosevelt signed that and agreed to that, they got together and made 21 more forest preserves, and then Roosevelt signed it. And so the Forest Service comes into being in 1905, and this was the purpose of the Forest Service, to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. And so that's where that began. Then we have another act that comes in that's been controversial in our days, is the Antiquity Act. And the Antiquities Act was put forth because there were these areas, that, especially historical areas, where people were becoming really concerned that they weren't being protected. Congress was slow to act. So they passed this Antiquity Act, which gave the president the authority to protect areas of historic or scientific interest. And it's been used by every president since it was enacted, and largely over local objection most of the time. If you look at all these 6 national parks were all originally designated national monuments under the Antiquities Act, and then Congress later transferred them and renamed them as national parks. But they all came out from under that Antiquities Act. What's interesting is there was opposition to that, and when you look at Grand Canyon, this is what the Williams son said. When the idea of let's have national parks maybe, then the Williams son said the national park idea represented a fiendish and diabolical scheme, and whoever fathered such an idea must have been suckled by a sow and raised by an idiot. And then President Roosevelt then established Grand Canyon National Monument in 1908. But most of the things under Integrity Act historically have been opposed locally. So when we look at the National Park Service, we can go back into 1871, where we had what was called the Hayden Expedition. And this was a group that was sent out way out west to this foreign area called Yellowstone, and to report back what it was like. And in that group was a Civil War photographer called by the name of William Henry Jackson, and a well-known painter by the name of Thomas Moran. For those that are into photography, this was a photo taken by Jackson in 1871. I mean, I'm amazed at the clarity and everything. And then one of the most famous paintings by Thomas Moran is titled the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. But these kind of things went back east, and people were enthralled by it, and the idea that they ought to be protected rather than having individuals get private gain from it. And so we have what then is called the Yellowstone Park Act, and it's signed by President Ulysses Grant and essentially sets aside the first national park in the whole world. But even here, you would see this paper thing by the Helena Gazette. We regard the passage of the act as a great blow struck at the prosperity of Bozeman. I think we would find a little difference in that, but it's interesting. History gives us an interesting perspective. If you look at one of the problems with national parks, and Yellowstone is a very good example, even though it's the second largest example in the system, it was put together with political boundaries rather than ecosystem boundaries. And so when you look in the center there, there's Yellowstone, but the ecosystem, the green shading in there is Forest Service lands outside the park. But when you look at the habitat and the ecosystem needed by bear, elk, and bison, that outer area is what's needed for them to fully function. And we know we have problems with the bison getting out into ranches. We have problem with the bears. The elk certainly get in and out. They're fenced, so they can't get into Jackson, Wyoming at this part. But all of these things this is a good example. We could have a whole other issue on boundaries of national parks and what they do and do not do. So anyway, we have the National Park Service comes into being in 1916, and you'll notice in that mission that it's to conserve the scenery as well as the natural and historic objects and the wildlife thereon. But the key there is to manage them in such a way that they exist now, and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren can go see the same thing. And it's interesting to me when we talk about, I used to hear all the time when I worked in San Juan County about, well, Canyonlands just locked everything up. And I remember I'd hired a young girl, about 17, to work for us as part of a little group. And at the end of the summer, she brought her dad up to me, and her dad had tears in his eyes, and he was really hesitant. And I said, what would you like to say? And he said, when my daughter first told me she was going to work in the park, and I thought, I have not been in that park since I was a kid. And he said, I did everything I could to convince her not to work for the Park Service. And then he paused and he started to sob a little bit. And I said, what do you think now? And he said, I've been up here with my daughter. It looks like it did when I was a kid. Please keep doing what you're doing. But then we have the BLM, because this is the biggest source of public lands in many of the states, but particularly Nevada and Utah. They were set aside as to manage the grazing service. So they manage all non-designated public lands that aren't parks or wildlife refuges or forests. They manage about 250 million acres. They also manage all oil, gas, and minerals on BLM and Forest Service lands. The BLM mission, somewhat like the Park Service, is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. They do have an emphasis on the minerals and grazing and those kind of things. Then we have what's called the Federal Policy and Management Act. For a time there'd been a constant transfer of public lands into private ownership. And there was concern raised that maybe too much of this was going on, that maybe it needed some kind of control. So this act was passed. You notice that it says that Congress can always dispose of public lands, but note that it has to be in the national interest. So the Congress could dispose of the BLM lands or Forest Service lands or Park Service lands, but the criteria is it has to be in the national interest do that, but it does give them authority to do that. So what you have right now in the United States, you have about 28% of the country's lands are in common ownership. We own all of them. We the people, every one of us on this call. The yellow is BLM. The green is U.S. Forest Service. The bright green is national parks. The blue is military. The red is Native American reservations. Of course, that's not considered public lands. And then embedded in that are wildlife refuges and all of that as well. So then let's take a look at the public land revenue to the state of Utah. The federal government gets revenue from the sale of grazing, of timber, the grazing of animals, and various things. And that revenue share to the state of Utah in 2018 was $74.5 million. The thing that's really sad about the revenues is that the federal government gets zero back for people who mine. In other words, the hard rock minerals, the U.S. government does not get anything back from those revenues, which ought to be fixed. And, that ought to be things that the state ought to be going after rather than just saying, give us the land. But they also, because there are a lot of federal land in Utah, that Congress passed the means for the states to get payment in lieu of taxes. In other words, since this federal land is within the state boundaries, but the states don't get any revenue from it, then the payment in lieu of taxes or PILT funds. In 2018, they got almost $41 million so a total revenue to the state in 2018 of $115 million. I would also say that the PILT funds have never been fully funded to where they should be. And so to me, the state ought to be going after the mineral, get the federal government to start collecting rights on the minerals, and they have to go after Congress to increase those PILT funds to where they need to be. When we look at the use of public lands, here's the main uses: fishing, hunting, off-road, four-wheel driving, mountain biking, river riding, horseback riding, and backpacking. Those public lands provide these uses. And if you've lived in states where there is no public land, like Texas, for example, some of these uses have to be acquired through negotiated, often costly contracted with private individuals. I worked or had a few things to do with the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area in Georgia, which flows through the middle of Atlanta. We had a lot of sections of that national recreation area where people could not go on the shore because it was private land. And so we were constantly trying to interact between users of the recreation area and the private landowners and trying to work out deals. And it was terrible at best. Then when we talk about what Utah's done, and this is an interesting one to me, they passed this in 2012, and it's non-binding on the federal government, but it's interesting. It was passed and signed by the governor, and those, I think what it points out is the amount of effort that is going on behind the scenes to get the acres of federal land, our common lands, and give them to the state. But this act called for, by 2014, 2 years after this passed, for the federal government to transfer all BLM and all U.S. Forest Service lands, the non-wilderness one, the entire Grand Canyon National Recreation Area, Lake Powell, and all of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, a total of 31 million acres they declared through state law that should be transferred to the state of Utah. And it stated that the state would be, the state would have actual ownership of the lands, and that the state retained the right to retain those lands or to sell any of it. So then the next question is, okay, if those lands were given, or even part of the lands were given to the state, what's the result of that? And so let me give you some figures that are really interesting. In 2018, the federal land costs for the federal land within the state of Utah boundaries BLM's budget was $125.4 million. The U.S. Forest Service budget was $69.5 million. Glen Canyon National Recreation Area was almost $12 million. BLM fire costs were almost $50,000. The Forest Service fire costs were $36 million. The federal revenue share that I just mentioned was $74.5 million, and the PILT funds were almost $41 million, for a total of cost to run those federal lands in 2018 was $406 million. So then the other thing that I would add with that is the fighting fires for the state of Utah in 2018 itself was $35 million. And so essentially, if the state took over these lands and they wanted to manage anything like they're managed now, they'd have to come up with millions of dollars before they could even begin to profit from them. The other thing that nobody talks about at all, and I'm trying to point out a number of things that in there that ought to be discussed and that people are really ignorant of, is that those operating costs of $406 million are distributed to all of the states. So we have 335 million people contribute to the cost that's needed to manage the federal lands in the state of Utah. So if we took those out of the federal thing, we would move a tax base of 335 million to a tax base of 3 million. And then if you want another glitch to look at, then look at the Utah Statehood Act of 1896. That in that Statehood Act said that if the federal government, well, I'll just read it, that 5% of the proceeds of the sales of public lands lying within Utah, which should be sold by the federal government subsequent to Utah becoming a state, that those revenues can be paid to the state to be used as a permanent fund, the interest of which only shall be expended for the support of the common schools within the said state. So if the federal government was to sell any of those lands, the state would only get 5% of it at a maximum of it. And so the other thing that I would say on this is that when you look at all these things, there are a lot of issues. And unfortunately, we've got caught as a state in this rhetoric as we got to get the federal land back, and that somehow we will manage them differently and better. But when you look at the state park system, it's badly underfunded. And we have golf courses in most of the state park system just to generate some operating revenue. And yet the state is supportive of the idea that we're going to bring all of this public use, we're going to manage it by the state in various ways, and we're going to be able to do that better than the federal government does. And so I would end, and then we'll throw it up for discussion, but I would end by a couple of quotes. I love the one by Olmsted in 1865. He says, "Those are rich enough reserve themselves the choicest natural scenes. Unless government acts, all places favorable in scenery to the recreation of the mind and body will be closed against the mass of the people." And then the last one, another one I like, is by President Teddy Roosevelt. "It's not what we have that will make us a great nation. It's the way in which we use it." So that's a quick overview thing. We could have a whole session on the history of the Park Service. We could do a lot of things. But I think when we've talked about a lot about our stewardship, and we've had a lot of discussion about how as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we're going to be held accountable for how we take care of this earth that was formed and created for us. And we're not doing a good job. And we get into these rhetorical type things, and we get loud acclaims, we get trumpets bleeding. But what we really need to do is be pushing the right questions. You know, we have barriers and grand staircases that have caused a lot of stuff. and we made these big designations because they quote unquote need to be protected. But nobody asked to start with is how is it being protected and what are the real protection needs? And so instead of maybe saying, well, BLM was a good enough steward, they just need 3 more rangers. Instead, we create this whole national monument, which gets worldwide acclaim. We've now had hundreds of thousands of people coming there that weren't coming before, and some of the areas are getting trashed. We have, problems with the Native Americans, who those sites are very sacred for them, and yet nothing was talked about how we could preserve their religious rights and things. We just made these political boundaries that, from a personal standpoint, I grew up in southern Utah. You're not going to convince me that the area between Kanab and Page is national monument. And yet that's part of the grand staircase because it was politically right to make that. When I grew up as a kid, all the national monuments, as far as I know, were managed by the National Park Service. The big areas were national parks. The smaller areas, I could laugh and call them wannabe parks, but they were managed as national monuments. But the management strategies were the same. You could go to one national monument, be the same. Now, every land management agency has at least 1 or 2 national monuments, and they're all managed under different management focuses and things. So the public, they don't know any difference. And so they cry, and I understand why they do, that what you do on the BLM land in Moab, you should be able to do at Canyonlands National Park. It's the same area. There's even roads that cross those boundaries because we've lost that distinction. And so when we make these political decisions, we get political results. We don't get resource results. We don't get good public use management results. So I will leave it with that before I get too far on my bandwagon. But I hope that kind of educates to everybody how we got to where we are and the challenges ahead if we continue down this path. So Tom and Doug, back to you.
It's very, very, very informative, Phil.
It's great, Phil.
I learned a lot. Thank you.
Can I start with a question for everybody? Phil, one of the last things you said, I think this was, is it Bears Ears? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay, on that one, it was designated as a national monument, I think you said, and it was big and sudden and without maybe the full process being thought through, and it upset some of the Native American neighbors or people that it's part of their sacred land. And but you also said that it brought in many visitors. Did a lot of people come in to that area after that designation?
Yeah. And Grand Staircase, the best example, because it's been around a long time. But, the barriers, that whole plateau that Bears Ears is on and southward, down across the highway that goes from Blanding to Natural Bridges, that's got some of the heaviest concentration of archaeological sites in the nation. I mean, there are ruins and structures in those canyons that nobody knew about that were being protected just because nobody knew about them. And so in my go ahead, Tom.
Well, I just want to follow up the very fact that many people are coming into those new national monuments ought to speak about the public desire to keep it as common land, as protected. I mean, what's going to happen to those people who want to access those sites if it's turned over to private property owners?
Well, if it is turned over to the state and sold or sold, you're absolutely right. I mean, go back to my original statement. Where would the $1 million houses be at Grand Canyon? Where would they be at Zion? Where would they be at Arches? And think of the parade of no trespassing signs. You go to the beaches in parts of the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, whatever it's called now, or the East Coast. They have to carve out access ways to the beach so that people can get to the beach.
This is an issue during my lifetime in California because, when I started here, there was less than 1 million people in the Bay Area. Now it's about 8. But during the 60s and 70s, they created the California Coastal Commission, which sort of froze. Everybody hated it, but I'm happy. And there's been some lawsuits about people who have tried to roll back public access because they want to exclude people from their $20 million homes. But you can't get it back. Once it's gone, the access to the coast is it's impossible. And there's been some lawsuits about that where people are still trying to exclude people from the coast in California. But in general, there's a lot of public access as a result of that legislation.
And Tom, and another problem in this, there's pluses and minuses to visitors. you know, and
That's true too.
and what you would hope. I mean, I've always felt like BLM ought to be the best loved federal agency in the system, but they're not. They're generally hated, and the Park Service used to always be number one. We love the agency type things, and it was the employees in the restrooms. It was in the details of the surveys. But what's happening now is these agencies, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the National Park Service this summer. But they're so understaffed now. You go in them, you don't see a ranger anymore. You don't even see a ranger in the information desk. You see volunteers, or you see student conservation students, those kind of things. So we're missing, on one hand, we're getting more visitors, but on the other hand, we don't have the staff to do the educational programs where we ought to educate them on how to use the parks properly. And what we're having now is with social media, we have people going into places that have never had many people. They take this look at me shot, post it on Facebook, and immediately there's 500 other people are figuring out a way to get to that same place. And so I know like from Zion, for example, some of those areas like the subway and things like that rarely had a lot of people now are getting thousands of people each year because of social media. And so we've got a real dilemma. And going back to Bears Ears, how nice it would have been had we just examined what needed to be protected and whether or not it was being protected. Where are the glitches? Can we just fix the glitch? Or do we have to create this national monument with political boundaries and everything that ticks literally everybody off? And I would be willing to bet that the protection is not much better. It may be even worse because of the increased visitation. And, coming out of COVID, I mean, the state of Utah did the Mighty Five campaign. And, this year, if I remember, the park's visitation overall has increased about 20-25%, but the foreign visitation hasn't returned yet. Those are Americans that are going for the first time or second or third time, but the foreign visitors haven't returned yet.
Phil, one of the things that I've always been concerned about, and you address this so eloquently, is when Utah claims they can manage the lands better. And all I have to look at, I mean, I've been a water guy, a public water guy my whole life. The state, look at how well the state has managed its water resources. The state owns all the waters within the state. They grant water rights to people to use it, but they've over appropriated so much these river systems that look at Great Salt Lake, and they are completely incapable now of dealing with the issues, including the public health issues associated with the dwindling Great Salt Lake. If they can't deal with those issues, how are they going to deal with millions of acres of state lands?
Well, and Doug, you're absolutely right. And what's interesting to me is, when I first went to Canyonlands in '96, there were areas down in the Neels area where the BLM. I remember one day standing outside the park, and this big group arrives off the Wasatch Front, probably all members of the church, and 8 ATVs side by side just go out through the desert. And we all know in this country, and one track can last 50 years or 100 years. It doesn't go away. And what happened with the Forest Service and the BLM you could largely do what you wanted in the forest and in the BLM lands. You could mountain bike where you wanted, you could ATV where you wanted. And so suddenly people are beginning to say, and BLM and the Forest Service start to realize that we're going to destroy what we're protecting if we don't get a handle on this use. And so BLM has started creating campsites instead of letting everybody camp where they want. They've started restricting where you go. I remember talking once down there in Moab where they said, well, we've got 5 roads to this one place. We don't need 5. All we need is 1. But the reaction to that from the public has been, oh, they're closing it. They're closing it off to us. They're shutting it down. And so BLM and Forest Service particularly are in the very unfortunate situation of trying to gain a handle or a control and better management of that stuff. And that's really at the basis for a lot of this. Get the federal land back. Let us manage it. Let us do what we want to do. And they're in a tough position. And there's, from what I can see, there's little or no educational effort to try and speak out about what they're doing.
Other questions for Phil?
Or comments? Does it make sense?
Bill, can you explain the patchwork of school lands? You said there was 4 out of 36 of those square miles. Why are they so separated, and why is it a patchwork? Why aren't they grouped together?
I don't know. I mean, Thomas Jefferson established that thing. You remember his background and stuff, but he established that. And somewhere in the mix, and I have no idea, Dave, they designated that Utah would get 4 sections. I mean, as I said, Colorado and Nevada only got 2, and I don't know about Idaho and some of the others. I haven't looked into it, but why Utah even got 4, I don't know. But those 4 were in that one thing where I circled them in yellow, and they're not connected. If you look at the maps around Moab, Canyonlands came into the system in 1964. And as part of the legislation, they actually took those trust lands that were going to be within Canyonlands boundary, lumped them together, and put them west of Arches. So when you look at the maps of trust lands, you'll find this solid group of blue on the map next to Arches, and those came from Canyonlands. And so it's one of the few places where you have a big enough area you could really, the state could allow a pretty good development in there. I'm glad they are separated because it restricts the ability, I hate to say this, restricts the ability of the state to do big developments or whatever within those.
The infrastructure would be too cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
To have where they're all spread out. If they were all together, it would be very easy to service it with public services and roads and.
Yeah, you're right, Doug.
What about the recent movement to trade public lands for private? We have this lands we can't use. It's better for this use than that use. There seems to be some good rationale for that in some cases.
Well, we've got a Congress right now. I'm not sure anything's irrational. I mean, I think they could do the most bizarre things right now. But I guess that's the thing that strikes me a little odd, Dave. There are some things that could be done with this Congress. And if you look at where the Forest Service lands and BLM lands are, and I love personally the rhetoric right now, which doesn't include getting the land back from parks. So I love that aspect of it. But there are lands that are Forest Service and BLM that maybe they could be traded out. Maybe they're in such a place that they're not heavily used by the public, or they aren't important to a particular use that could be traded out, and the state could do what they wanted with them. I mean, it seems to me that's a place for the state to go and to go after the PILT funds and get Congress to pass a law that allowed the federal government to keep the revenues from the hard rock mining. Those hard rock mineral revenues, the state, I think, gets something like 10-15%. The federal government gets nothing from hard rock mining. And, I think there's some, I think that's what bothers me the most about this, Dave, is this rhetoric is get the lands back, get our federal lands back, and I already explained my thoughts on that. But I think there are some things that would be reasonable to pursue, but those are getting lost in the rhetoric.
Hey, Phil, on the where do we go from here part of it, is there a model of a modern right now model of a particular state or area or public land that you think is working well or is doing something new or exciting, or we just give it back to the Indians and leave it fallow? I mean, I'm not quite sure, but what is it that you think is a good model?
Well, I mean, I think education plays a huge role in this, Tom, and it's missing. I mean, I blame the Park Service for not educating the public like they used to do on the purpose of the national parks. I think those agencies are, but again, unfortunately, they don't have the staff to do that. But I know in Moab, our staff got into every fourth grade school in San Juan County. San Juan County is very anti-feds, and yet we got into those fourth grades. I remember having a friend of mine who taught school in Blanding. I had to go to the bathroom, and I was coming back to Moab one night. I'm in full uniform, and I step out of my car in front of his house, and this little kid next door comes running over, and he says, "Are you a ranger?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Cool." And I thought, all right, our fourth grade program is working. And that's what we thought in those areas, Tom, is we've got to get to the kids. We've got to embed in the kids the idea of parks, the idea of taking care of things, and that. As to an ideal thing, I can't tell you one, because right now staffing is a big issue across the areas. I can show you states that are gone the wrong way. One is Texas. They have no public lands, none. And they have a state park system that's trying to do a lot of things, but they're small, and if they do anything like off-roading and stuff, they have to negotiate with private landowners to allow it. Most of those things are unsuccessful.
Well, I'm not too sure about the educational wing of this whole thing, because I heard this morning that while 80% of Americans are literate, 51% are almost literate at a sixth grade level. That's over the entire population of the United States now. Wow. So I'm not sure. Maybe we do need to shake up education, because it's not working anyway.
But when I first, I'd say 20 years ago, the problem group in Moab was the Jeep people. They would drive everywhere, anywhere, and through a good process of working with them, and 80% internally in those Jeep groups, they're good groups. They're smart. They're resource concerned. The group now is the ATV groups. And so there is progress going, and the Jeep group kind of polices their own. Jeep Safari, though you have that massive intrusion in southeast Utah, they're pretty good at managing their own and getting the word out and stuff.
Well, maybe that's the approach, is to find other public interest groups that don't want to just sell it off for luxury homes, that want to keep it as public lands, and let them be involved in the organization to protect public lands for their uses.
I think we have to do that, Tom. I don't think we can do that without. I think there's too much negative feelings and stuff out there to not do that. I know when shortly before I retired, I met with the Blue Ribbon Coalition, and they're a user group, and they were pretty much against the Park Service. And I remember I met with them at one of their annual banquets, and I just said to them, you guys are out there, tell us what you're finding. If you want some projects, come, we'd love to have you help us. And I remember afterward, a number of people came up and said, wow, I've never seen the Park Service that way before. You're actually asking us for help. And I blame the Park Service for that. we kind of keyed in on groups and said, oh, they're bad guys. But I know from my personal experience in managing parks, 20 years ago, if a Sierra Club called me up and said, we're going to support you on this issue, I'd lean back in my chair and celebrate. But the last 20 years, if any group said, I'm going to help support you on this, I had to sit back and say, okay, what's the cost of that group publicly supporting me? And trying to worm my way management wise between the extremes got to be very difficult. And I think it's still hard.
Well, we're glad you came on today. Any other questions for Phil? We're past the witching hour, but it's been fantastic, Phil.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.